Hey everybody, and welcome to this video where I go through the beginning of Matthew chapter 12. It's the continuation in the series on New Testament studies. Please do give the video a thumbs up and make sure you watch the other videos in the series as well. So, Matthew chapter 12, we're just going to look at the first, about a third or half of this chapter because there's quite a lot to go through. At that time, Jesus went through the cornfields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some ears of corn and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So what do we see taking place here? We see Jesus just really walking through some fields with his disciples, and they pick some of the corn, and then the Pharisees jump out. It's as if they were, waiting, looking for an opportunity, even possibly following Jesus, looking for an opportunity to jump up on him and accuse him of doing something wrong. What's funny here as well is that it's the disciples who were eating, but Jesus who is challenged, and we see that quite a lot, don't we? So what can we talk about here? Well, let's just understand the context. The disciples were not being accused of stealing food. It was actually the biblical Old Testament law that farmers, when they were going through their crops, harvesting, they would only go through the fields once, and that would mean that they would actually leave some crops, and they were supposed to leave those for the poor. It was a sort of Old Testament benefit system. It wasn't really seen as a handout because the poor would have to go into the fields and get the food for themselves, but it was there to help. So it was a great sort of system that was in place. And what was happening was the disciples being hungry, they were just picking the corn, and then you would rub it between your fingers, and the inedible bits would sort of drop off, and then you would sort of keep rubbing it between your fingers. It would make a sort of gum that you could chew on. But the Pharisees were actually critical of what was going on here because it took place on the Sabbath, and we need to understand a little bit about the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is the day of rest. Now, we saw in Genesis, when God created the world, that he created the world in 6 days, and then on the seventh day he rested. It tells us by the seventh day God had finished the work he'd been doing, so on the seventh day he rested from all his work. And I always think that's quite interesting, because God, who is all powerful, all knowing, all amazing, didn't need to rest. He wasn't tired, but he was modeling to us what we should do, the idea of working for 6 days and resting on the Sabbath. So the Sabbath then is something that God himself modeled, and it is one of the 10 commandments in Exodus 20, 8, 9, 10. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. So, why is that? There are lots of ideas about that. On the one hand, it's a very good practical principle, isn't it, to rest 1 day a week. I know myself, running this YouTube channel and doing a lot of online work, it's very easy to work 7 days a week, 18 hours a day, doing all the various things there are to do, and that wipes you out. So on a practical level, it's good to rest 1 day a week. But the Sabbath rest is an act of faith. It's a reminder that no matter what we do, God is in control. So when we stop pursuing our material goals for 1 day each week, we're saying, God, I trust you to maintain control while I spend this day focusing on you. I trust you to provide for my needs 7 days a week, even if I only work for 6 of them, regardless of how much money I could earn today, or how, many things I still have that I need to get done. Today I'm going to rest my mind and body, and I'm going to delight in your presence. And that's what the Sabbath is about. Of course, this leads to the question, well, how were these guys breaking the Sabbath? They weren't working. And this is the religiosity of the Pharisees, who would have said, well, they were working. So there's a list of things you can't do on the Sabbath: working, farming, reaping, threshing, winnowing, preparing food. And they would have said that that's what these disciples were doing when they were picking the ears of corn. They were reaping. When they were rubbing them between their hands, they were threshing and winnowing, preparing food and eating it. So it's a really ridiculous accusation, a very, what we would call a religious one, based on a group of people, as we know, the Pharisees, based all on the laws, the rules, the regulations, the traditions. Now, I just want you to stop and pause and think, how would you respond to this if you were Jesus? You know, you could say, why are you talking to me about what the disciples are doing? They're their own people. You could say, I've already told you, I've come, the law is not something you're going to be held to now, these ceremonial laws, because I'm coming, to offer true forgiveness. You could, be pretty rude to them. But Jesus answers them in a way that I think is quite interesting. Oh, here's that picture of that scene. Jesus answers them by basically, sorry, I'm going to make you go dizzy as I go back a few slides, by basically saying, well, haven't you read what David did? Now, the Pharisees, of course, knew the scriptures inside out. So I like this, because I think basically the approach Jesus is taking is he's answering them in a way they'd understand. He's saying, well, you've read this. Let me make it clear to you what it really means. And he's saying that, the work of priests isn't breaking the law of the Sabbath. Serving Christ is now serving the new temple, and acts of necessity, acts of ministry. They don't have to follow the Sabbath law. So he explains it to them in a way that is relevant to them, when every part within me would want to just say, oh, shut up, you idiots. What are you on about? But of course, I'm not Jesus. So that's one of the interesting things here. But of course, the religiosity of the Pharisees, that they would want to follow all of these rules and regulations and make everything all about, this kind of strict religious ritual, is not what Jesus is about. And he says, as I go through these again, he says this very interesting line, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now, there's often an allegation made, and it springs to mind because somebody said something like this to me yesterday, that there are two different gods in the Bible. The God of the Old Testament is mean and punishes and violent, and the God of the New Testament is kind and loving. As if halfway through, God sort of had a little bit of a think and thought, maybe I should be nicer. But that isn't true. And this idea of I desire mercy, not sacrifice, really is about the whole essence of God, not just in the New Testament. So, for example, if you actually look at the books of the Old Testament and we put them in chronological order, we know that Jonah, the book of Jonah, is one of the oldest books in the Bible, and many scholars believe it to be the oldest that we actually have our hands on. And if you think about the story of Jonah, God wanted to save the people of Nineveh. But Jonah didn't want to. He ran away because he didn't like the mercy that God was showing. And there's even this great line in the sort of end of chapter 3, beginning of chapter 4. He, talking about God, had compassion, but Jonah was greatly displeased. So the idea that God is this sort of angry, punishing God of the Old Testament. No, God has always been the same, always is the same, compassionate, merciful. And mercy is a key word for Christian life. What is mercy? There's grace and there's mercy. And mercy is actually withholding what we deserve. So being merciful is to not give somebody what they deserve, the punishment that they deserve. Grace is to give something good to somebody who doesn't deserve it. Mercy is holding back the bad that somebody deserves. So, Jesus is really saying here, what I want is for you to be merciful. Don't tie yourself up in these rules and regulations, and this kind of religiosity which would seek to say that because they picked some corn to eat, they're farming and therefore they're breaking the law. That's not what it's about. And then we have this bit, which is just really the same sort of story. Going on from that place, he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And if you've been watching this series of videos, it's a continuation of the metaphor of followers of God as sheep. And I think I explored that in the previous video, or maybe one before that. So check that out for a full explanation of how we are like sheep. Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Can you believe this? Jesus performs these miracles. How do they respond? They want to kill him. We saw it previously, haven't we? We've seen it in the whole series. Jesus goes around doing pretty much the same thing, but the way people react is so different. And we cannot predict the way people are going to react to, Jesus, to the message of God, to the Bible. Final thing for this video that I just want to talk about then is this last bit about God's chosen servant. Aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place. A large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. "Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break. A smouldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name the nations will put their hope." A couple of things here. Another Old Testament prophecy that is proven by the life of Jesus. And this is Matthew writing to a predominantly Jewish readership, and therefore aiming to show them, look, these Old Testament prophecies that you believe in are proven by Jesus. The second thing, again, is this sense of the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament being the same. But the third thing is this idea of, "Here is my servant." Jesus is referred to as a servant. He came as one to be a servant. And what does a servant do? A servant thinks of the needs of others. Okay, so Jesus could have come as anything he wanted, as a boss, as someone to be served, but he came to serve. It's mind-blowing, and it's a great model for us to serve others. Philippians 2, verse 4 to verse 7 says this. Let me just find it here. It says, "Not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness." So this challenge to us to serve others, to put others' needs before ourselves. And of course, if we all did that, through the grace of God, through him equipping us to be able to do it, wouldn't the world be a better place? Thanks for watching this video, and please do subscribe if you haven't done so already.